John had always been a creature of habit, a man who thrived in the predictable ebb and flow of his routine. The mundane tasks that filled his days, the commute, the reports, the quiet evenings spent on the couch with Megan, had once felt like the anchors of his life. But now, they felt like chains. It was a quiet afternoon when everything changed. John had wrapped up an early meeting and decided to come home sooner than usual. The day had been long, but he wasn't thinking about work when he pulled into the driveway. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular, really, just about the softness of the couch, the warmth of their home. But as he opened the front door, something caught his attention. The house, usually a sanctuary of quiet comfort, felt different. The hum of the refrigerator, the soft creaks of the floorboards, even the faint scent of the candles Megan liked to burn, it all felt off. The front room was dimly lit, but John noticed right away the absence of Megan's voice. The house should have been filled with the usual sounds, her laugh, the sound of her humming as she prepared dinner. Instead, there was silence. Then, a noise, a strange, unbidden sound, came from the direction of the master bedroom. John stood frozen, his heart suddenly heavy, an unshakable weight pressing down on his chest. He had known, of course. There had been little things, slips in her speech, unexplained absences, the secretive glances she cast when she thought he wasn't paying attention, but he'd never let himself believe it. His mind had played tricks on him, telling him that everything was fine. He had hoped everything was fine. But as he moved closer to the bedroom, the unmistakable sound of quiet, hurried voices made his stomach twist in knots. And there she was, Megan, his wife, tangled up with another man. Her laugh, that laugh he'd once thought was only his to hear, was now shared with someone else. John didn't move, didn't make a sound. He simply stood there, watching, his breath shallow, his mind working overtime to process the scene in front of him. His chest tightened with a mix of hurt, disbelief, and something else. Something he hadn't expected. Anger? No, not yet. But something cold and quiet began to rise within him, like a force he couldn't control. This was it. This was the moment. The moment everything changed. But instead of confronting her, instead of storming in, demanding answers, he did nothing. John stood still, watching, his mind already racing, already formulating a plan. A plan that would change everything. John stood motionless, his gaze fixed on Megan and the man she had so easily replaced him with. It was all happening in front of him, unfolding like some dark, twisted version of his worst fears. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing in his ears. But even in that whirlwind of emotion, there was a strange stillness within him. He wasn't sure what it was at first, this calm that settled into his gut, but it was there, steadfast, unyielding. The man in the room with Megan looked like the type who could sweep someone off their feet without breaking a sweat. His features were sharp, his smile too confident, and the way he held Megan, as if she were something he could easily take for granted, it all felt like an insult to everything John had believed in, to the life they had built together. But John didn't let himself feel the anger right then. Instead, he felt a coldness, a quiet understanding. For years, he had been her rock, her confidant, her partner in everything. They had built a life together, a house full of memories that had, up until now, seemed impenetrable. Yet here she was, with another man in their bed, betraying him in the most intimate way possible. It was a betrayal, not just of love, but of trust. And what stung the most was how little effort it seemed to take for Megan to cross that line. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he thought he could trust with everything, had thrown it all away. But John wasn't the type to lash out, to demand answers in the heat of the moment. He had never been that man. Instead, he chose to wait. He stood there in the doorway, watching them for a moment longer, as his mind worked through the options, calculating his next move with the precision of a seasoned strategist. Megan shifted in the bed, unaware of his presence, her laugh filling the air. John's grip tightened on the doorframe, but his face remained neutral. He wasn't angry. Not yet. But he could feel the tide of emotion rising slowly, steadily, like a wave building up in the distance. It would come, eventually, but for now, John was calm. He didn't leave. He didn't confront her. Instead, he did something that surprised even him. He turned and walked away. Slowly, quietly, he retreated down the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath him. There was no reason to confront her now. No need to make a scene. No need to let her know that he had caught her in the act. She didn't deserve to see the hurt on his face, didn't deserve to witness the slow burn of betrayal that was beginning to consume him from the inside out. The next few days were a blur of quiet tension. John went through the motions of his daily routine, his mind constantly drifting back to that moment in the bedroom. Megan, for her part, acted as if nothing had changed. She smiled at him in passing, talked to him like everything was normal. But John knew better. He could see the cracks in her facade now, the way she tried to avoid his eyes, the way she became a little more distant every day. He didn't speak to her about what he had seen. Instead, he observed. He watched how she moved through their home, how she tried to act as if nothing had shifted between them. But John could feel it in the air, something was different. The comfortable silence that had once been the hallmark of their relationship now felt hollow. The trust was gone, shattered, and nothing could ever fill the void that had been created. For the next week, John let Megan believe that he was oblivious, that he hadn't seen what she had done. He didn't confront her, didn't demand an explanation. Instead, he became a stranger in his own home, moving through the motions of life as if he were a visitor. He didn't react to her questions, didn't engage in her attempts at normalcy. And through it all, he kept his emotions in check, refusing to let her see the hurt that simmered beneath the surface. But there was something else, something far more dangerous, brewing inside of him. John had always prided himself on being a patient man, a man who could control his emotions even in the most difficult situations. But this was different. This wasn't a petty argument or a passing misunderstanding. This was betrayal, plain and simple, and it cut deeper than anything he had ever experienced. Megan had taken something from him that could never be returned. And she had done it without a second thought. John began to plot. Not with anger, but with quiet resolve. He would make her understand the consequences of her actions. He would make her see what happened when trust was broken. But he would do it in his own way, on his terms, and with a precision that would leave no room for doubt. He didn't need to confront her, to shout or demand answers. The power was in his silence. The power was in taking control of the situation and walking away, leaving her with nothing but the knowledge that he was no longer the man she could manipulate, no longer the man she could rely on. And as John sat down one evening to prepare for the next phase of his plan, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was the first step toward reclaiming his life. He would take control, and Megan would be the one left to deal with the consequences of her own choices. Days turned into weeks, and John continued to maintain his silence. Megan had no idea how to read him now. She sensed the distance between them, the absence of the warmth that used to radiate between them like a comforting embrace. She continued to act as if things were normal, but every interaction felt strained, like two people playing a part in a script they no longer understood. John, on the other hand, had transformed. His quiet presence in their home was no longer a symbol of patience or understanding. It was a calculated silence, a space where Megan's every move felt scrutinized. He didn't need to shout, didn't need to make accusations. The way he carried himself, the calm in his voice, the distance in his eyes, spoke volumes. At work, John was the same, focused, determined, but with a new edge to his demeanor. His colleagues noticed the change, the way he seemed a little more detached, a little more composed. They didn't know the pain he was carrying, the betrayal he had witnessed, but they could sense something was different. It wasn't just the way he carried himself, it was the unspoken tension that lingered around him. Meanwhile, Megan remained oblivious to the quiet storm brewing inside him. She had begun to let her guard down, thinking that perhaps the worst was over, that John would eventually confront her, or at the very least, ask her what had been going on. But John didn't give her that satisfaction. Instead, he maintained his cool, kept his distance, and let her stew in the consequences of her actions. One evening, after a long day at work, John came home to find Megan pacing in the kitchen. Her face was tight with worry, her movements restless. He could tell she had something on her mind, but he said nothing. He simply walked past her and into the living room, as if nothing had changed. Megan followed him, her footsteps light but hesitant. "John, we need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. John didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat down in his favorite chair and leaned back, his eyes fixed on the TV, though he wasn't really watching. He had a plan now, and every step was unfolding exactly as he had imagined it. He was in control, and he knew that this conversation, this moment, would be the one where everything shifted. Megan, still standing in the doorway, looked at him with a mixture of confusion and frustration. "Why are you doing this? Why won't you talk to me?" she asked, her voice rising with impatience. John finally turned his head, his eyes meeting hers, but there was no anger in his gaze. There was nothing but calm. "Talk about what?" he asked, his tone even, almost casual. Megan took a step closer, her hand resting on the back of the couch. "You know exactly what I'm talking about. The affair. You've seen it with your own eyes, but you're acting like nothing happened." He could see the hurt in her eyes now, the way she was trying to hold it together, trying to maintain her composure. But John wasn't moved by it. Not anymore. He had seen it all, her lies, her deceit, her betrayal, and now it was time for her to face the consequences of her choices. "You're right," John said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of finality. "I did see it, and I don't need to talk about it because I already know everything I need to know." Megan blinked, the words hanging in the air between them like a heavy fog. "What do you mean? Are you just going to pretend like this never happened? Just ignore it?" "No," John replied, his eyes still locked on hers. "I'm not pretending. I'm letting you see what happens when trust is broken. I'm letting you see what happens when someone chooses to betray the one person who always had their back. This isn't something you can just sweep under the rug, Megan. It's a choice you made, and now you'll live with the consequences." The words hit her harder than he expected. Megan faltered, her expression shifting from confusion to realization. For the first time, she saw a glimmer of something she hadn't recognized before, something cold, something final in John's demeanor. It was as if she were looking at a stranger. The man she had married, the one who had always been there for her, was no longer there. He had been replaced by someone stronger, someone who had made peace with the fact that their marriage was over. Megan's eyes filled with tears, and she took a step forward. "John, please. I'm sorry. I never meant for it to happen this way. I never wanted to hurt you. Can't we just fix this?" John stood up slowly, the movement deliberate. "No, Megan. You don't get to fix this. You don't get to come back from this. You've already made your choice, and now it's time for me to make mine." He walked past her, his steps calm, controlled, and with every movement, he felt the last remnants of the life he had shared with her slip further away. Megan stood there, unable to speak, the silence between them now more deafening than any argument could ever be. John went to his bedroom and began to pack. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. There was no going back now. He had taken control of his life again, and the weight that had been crushing him for so long was finally starting to lift. Megan would have to face the consequences of her actions, but John? He was free. And as he zipped up his bag, he felt a sense of empowerment wash over him. It wasn't just the freedom from her betrayal, it was the freedom from everything she had tried to make him believe about their marriage. This was his moment. His life was his to reclaim. And he was ready to walk away. John's heart didn't race as he packed his things. There was no panic, no overwhelming rush. It was almost as though a switch had flipped inside him, the years of silent patience, of putting up with Megan's small betrayals, finally giving way to something else, something stronger, more resolute. This wasn't just about her affair anymore. This was about taking back the life he had lost. This was about him, and only him. The man who had once been consumed by the need to please her, to keep her happy at any cost, now moved with a new purpose. His thoughts were clear and methodical, each step of his packing deliberate and calm. He didn't rush. He didn't even feel a sense of urgency. His life was no longer dependent on her or the house they had built together. As John folded his clothes and organized his belongings, a strange sense of clarity began to settle over him. The house that had once felt like a home now felt like a prison. Every corner, every inch of space had been tainted by her betrayal. The memories of their life together seemed like distant echoes, once meaningful, now irrelevant. He had outgrown this version of himself, the man who had been willing to forgive, to bend over backward for someone who couldn't offer the same in return. John paused for a moment by the window, looking out at the suburban street that had always felt so familiar. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow across the yard. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt like everything was still the way it was supposed to be. But he knew it wasn't. Everything had changed. He looked at the clock. Megan would be home soon. He didn't need to rush, he had already made his decision. She had no idea what was coming, and John had no intention of giving her the satisfaction of begging him to stay, no intention of allowing her to play the victim in this situation. He had been the one who had been wronged, and he would leave, not in anger or spite, but in complete and utter control. When Megan walked through the door later that evening, she immediately noticed the absence of John's presence in the house. The air felt different, charged, tense. It was as if the silence between them had grown heavier, pressing in on her from all sides. She called out his name, but there was no answer. The house felt emptier than it ever had before. She made her way upstairs, and that's when she saw it, his suitcase, neatly packed, sitting by the door. Her breath caught in her throat. For a moment, she didn't understand what was happening. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together in her mind, and she felt a wave of panic rise within her. She rushed into the bedroom, her heart pounding in her chest. John was standing there, his back to her as he finished organizing a few last items. She could feel the tension in the air, the distance between them that had never been there before. It was as if he were a stranger, someone she didn't recognize. "Megan," John said quietly, without turning around. "I'm done. I've been done for a while, but I'm finally ready to move on." Her voice wavered as she stepped forward. "John, please. I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. We can fix this. Just talk to me. Let's work through it." But John didn't look at her. He simply zipped up the suitcase and took a step toward the door. "There's nothing left to fix, Megan," he said, his voice cold but controlled. "I gave you everything I had. And you chose to throw it all away. You don't get to undo that. Not now, not ever." The silence that followed felt suffocating. Megan stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. She hadn't expected this. She had thought, at worst, John would confront her, demand an explanation, maybe fight for her. She hadn't expected him to simply walk away. John opened the door and stepped into the hallway. Megan followed him, her voice rising in desperation. "John, please. Don't do this. I love you. I made a mistake. I'll do anything to make it right." But John didn't stop. He didn't even flinch. "You don't love me," he said softly, his voice steady. "If you did, you never would have done this in the first place. You don't get to manipulate me anymore, Megan. You don't get to control me. Not after everything you've done." With that, he walked out of the house, leaving Megan standing in the doorway, her chest tightening with the realization that she had lost him for good. John didn't look back. He didn't need to. The life he had once shared with Megan was behind him now. As he walked down the driveway and got into his car, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. The decision had been made. There was no turning back. He drove away, heading toward a future that was entirely his own, one where he could rebuild from the ground up. It was bittersweet, but it was also the first step toward his freedom. The past was gone, and with it, so was his fear. John was free. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the full force of his own strength. The days following John's departure from their home felt like a blur for Megan. At first, there was an empty silence that filled the space where their arguments, their moments of laughter, and even their silence used to be. It was as if the house had lost its heartbeat, the very rhythm of their life together now silenced. Megan hadn't anticipated this, hadn't understood that John, the man she thought she could manipulate with her charm, would walk away so easily. She had always believed that, in the end, he would forgive her, would beg her to stay, but instead, she was left with nothing. Megan tried to reach out to him at first, calling him, texting him, sending messages of regret, but each attempt was met with nothing but cold indifference. It was like speaking into a void, her words swallowed up by the distance between them. She tried to convince herself that he would come around, that he would return, but as the days stretched into weeks, the truth began to settle in. John was gone, and he wasn't coming back. Her friends and family offered their support, but it wasn't the same. No one understood the depths of her loss, how much she had taken for granted, how easily she had sabotaged her own happiness. She had always thought she could have it all, that she could keep John at arm's length while indulging in her desires. But now, with John gone, she realized how truly empty her world had become. The man she had built her life with, the man who had once been everything to her, was now a distant memory. John, on the other hand, had slowly begun to rebuild his life. He didn't feel triumphant, but there was a quiet satisfaction that came with knowing he had made the right choice. He had rediscovered himself in the days after leaving Megan. The weight of their marriage, the years spent in a cycle of doubt and compromise, had been replaced with the freedom to live for himself. He no longer had to second-guess every decision, no longer had to fight for a love that was never truly his to begin with. In his newfound peace, John had started to reconnect with old friends, to invest in the hobbies he had long abandoned in favor of keeping the peace. There was a sense of relief that washed over him, a sense that he was finally in control of his own life again. He had no intention of seeking revenge or making Megan feel the same pain he had once endured. His freedom, his peace, was the ultimate victory. And as the days passed, John realized something important, that by walking away, he had not only freed himself from the shackles of his past, but he had also found his own strength, something he had never truly recognized in himself until now.